Hi, Elio. Shall we start?
نزلت مروان ويب اي اكس WEB مروان.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I declare open the United Nations International Conference on the Question of Jerusalem, Annexation in Practice, Palestinian Life in Jerusalem. Your Excellency, Ambassador Ali Untali, Director of the Department of Palestine and All Quds Affairs of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Your Excellency, Ambassador Riyad Mansour, Permanent Observer of the State of Palestine to the United Nations, Mr. Khalil Kiari, Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, represented the United Nations and the Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, let me welcome our audience to the International Conference on the Question of Jerusalem under the theme Annexation in Practice, Palestinian Life in Jerusalem, organized by the United Nations Committee on the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. I am Ana Silvia Rodriguez Abascal, Ambassador and Charge d'Affaires of the Permanent Mission of Cuba to the United Nations here in New York, and I chair of the UN Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian people. I have the honor today to moderate this virtual event. In these unprecedented times, when Israel, the occupying power, has declared its plan to annex large areas of the occupied Palestinian territory, amid of the situation exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, we are meeting virtually to rally our support and solidarity for the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including the right to self-determination and independence, with a special focus on the question of Jerusalem. In our last virtual event, the UN Forum on the Question of Palestine on 4 June, three high-level speakers outlined prevailing challenges and formulated recommendations to overcome negative trends and the current political impasse for salvaging peace prospects. The shared summary and recording of the event can be found on the committee website www.un.org/UNISPAL. I repeat, www.un.org/UNISPAL. Today, we are convening for the first part of the annual conference on Jerusalem, and it is my pleasure to welcome to this event three distinguished panelists. Ms. Maha Abdallah, legal researcher at the Cairo Institute of the Human Rights Study in Jerusalem. Ms. Hagit Ofran, director of the Settlement Watch Project at Peace Now in Jerusalem. And Mr. Osamah Khalil, associated professor of history at Syracuse University in the United States. You are most welcome to this event. They will highlight the history of Israel's decade of long illegal annexation of Israel Jerusalem and the life reality of Palestinian Jerusalemites under this regime. Before we get into our panel, I would like to give the floor to the representatives of the United Nations, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the State of Palestine for their opening remarks. I would like to first request the representatives of the United Nations, Mr. Khalil Kiari, Assistant Secretary General for Middle East, Asia, and Pacific in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, to take the floor. Before giving the floor, I ask the other participants to mute your microphone in order not to bother the event. So I give the floor to Mr. Chiari to have the floor, sir.
Thank you, and I'm happy to see you, dear Ambassador, moderating today's conference. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the International Conference on the Question of Jerusalem, organized by the United Nations Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People with support of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. There is a deep sense of concern among a vast majority of the nations of the world over the evolving situation in Israel and Palestine. We are indeed at a watershed moment. Israel's threat to annex part of the occupied West Bank has alarmed Palestinians, many Israelis, and the broader international community. If implemented, annexation would constitute a most serious violation of international law, have dangerous and costly implications on the ground, grievously harm the prospect of a two-state solution, and undercut the possibilities of renewal of negotiations. I call on the Israeli government to abandon its annexation plans, and I call upon the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian people to maintain their steadfast commitment to the path of nonviolence. In this context, I welcome the statement of the Palestinian leadership calling for a return to the negotiation table. In addition to the potentially destabilizing consequences of a possible annexation, the Palestinian fiscal and economic situation is in dire straits. The response by the Palestinian leadership to Israel's annexation plans, ending all coordination with Israel, including financial coordination, along with the uncertainty and economic hardship caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, has resulted in an 80% decline in Palestinian revenues and has had a devastating impact on the government's ability to function and deliver service to its people. While we urge the international community to continue its support and assistance to the Palestinian people, there is an urgent need to restart Israel-Palestinian engagement, particularly on humanitarian and COVID-19 related issues, without losing sight of long-term political objectives. In this regard, I urge Israeli and Palestinian leaders to commit to restarting meaningful dialogue with the support of the international community. I encourage regional and international supporters of the two-state solution to help bring the parties back to a path that leads to a negotiated, peaceful settlement. I call on fellow members of the Middle East Quartet to take up our mandated mediation role and find a mutually agreeable framework for the parties to re-engage with each other and with regional states. You have the full commitment of the United Nations to continue supporting Palestinians and Israelis to resolve the conflict and end the occupation in line with international law, relevant United Nations resolutions, and bilateral agreements. The goal is achieving the vision of two states, Israel and an independent, democratic, sovereign, and viable Palestinian state, living side by side in peace and security within secure and recognized borders based on the pre-1967 lines, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. The position of the United Nations in this regard is clear and unwavering. It has been defined throughout the years by resolutions of the Security Council and General Assembly, and reiterated time and again by the Secretary General. There is no peaceful, sustainable alternative to a negotiated two-state solution. The United Nations will never give up on this goal because it is a just goal. We will continue working every day for peace and for security for all. The focus of our gathering today is Jerusalem. The city is a critical fulcrum in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Holy to the followers of the world's three monotheistic religions, the sensitivity surrounding it cannot be overstated. It is essential to fully respect the status quo at the holy sites and observe relevant agreements. It is also a key final status issue whose fate can only be decided through negotiations between the parties. The Israeli annexation being threatened in parts of the occupied West Bank has already occurred in East Jerusalem. Just as annexation in the West Bank would be in violation of international law, so it is in East Jerusalem, as stated in United Nations Security Council Resolution 476 and 478 of 1980. Measures aimed at changing East Jerusalem's demographic composition, character, and status are also a violation of international law and of United Nations resolutions. Ongoing administrative and other actions taken by the Israeli government, in particular continued demolitions, alongside the planning regime that makes it very difficult for Palestinians to obtain building permits, make life harder and in some cases impossible for Palestinian Jezreelites to continue living in their native city. In short, the United Nations does not recognize Israel's claim of sovereignty over East Jerusalem and is concerned over any unilateral moves that prejudge the outcome of negotiations and jeopardize peace. I want to reiterate that we will continue supporting a peaceful resolution of the question of Palestine, including the question of Jerusalem, on the basis of United Nations resolutions, international law, and previous agreements. We will do that through the good offices of the Secretary General as part of the Middle East Quartet, through the efforts of the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, and through the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs in New York, including its Division for Palestinian Rights, which serves as the Secretariat and implements the activities of the United Nations Committee on the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. In this spirit, I wish you fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalil. I'm so happy also to see you in your new position. The committee appreciates the support of the United Nations Secretariat, which is instrumental for the discharge of the committee's mandate. I would also like to express the committee's sincere thanks to the Secretary General Guterres for his unwavering support to the committee, but more importantly, for his principal position clearly stated on 22 June to the Security Council in upholding the UN Charter, international law, and norms, especially on the question of Palestine. The committee fully supports the Secretary General's effort to stem the Israeli plan of annexation and to restart the peace process. I would like now to request the representative of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, His Excellency Ambassador Ali Kuntali, Director of the Department of Palestine and All-Quds Affairs of the OIC, who is joining us from Jeddah to deliver his remarks. Good afternoon, sir, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. Your Excellency and dear friend, Ambassador Khalid Khiari, Assistant Secretary General and Representative of the UN Secretary General, Your Excellency, Ambassador Ana Silvia Rodriguez, Vice Chair of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, Your Excellency, Ambassador Dr. Riyad Mansour, Permanent Observer of the State of Palestine to the United Nations. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. At the outset, allow me to convey the greetings of the OIC Secretary General, His Excellency Dr. Youssef Al-Uthaymeen, and express the OIC deep appreciation for the fruitful cooperation, among which today's international conference on the question of Jerusalem and regular political consultations and coordination between the two organizations, the UN and the OIC. I would also like to commend the valuable role and efforts of the UN and all its organs in support for achieving a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, and in favor of the socio-economic development of the Palestinian people. It takes place extremely characterized by developments, occupied Palestinian territory, Israel next part of the occupied territory, historical rights of the Palestinian people. Yes. Yes.
We are having problem with your sound. Let's try again to see, but we are not receiving your sound very well.
Perhaps he can move closer to his router. That may help. I shut off his camera. We'll see if that helps. Thank you.
Could you start again? The technician recommend to shut down your camera.
Yes. I'll take that liberty right now.
Mr. Gutali, do you hear me?
Okay. Perhaps we can reach out via back channels to help him.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Do you hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this meeting takes place at an extremely critical juncture, characterized by serious developments in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, particularly the recent Israeli government's threat to annex parts of the occupied Palestinian territory, which run against the historical, legal, and political rights of the Palestinian people and represent a blatant violation of international law, the UN Charter, and relevant UN resolutions. In response to this serious challenge, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation held recently, and precisely 10th of June, a virtual extraordinary meeting at the level of foreign ministers, which adopted a resolution explicitly rejecting the illegal Israeli annexation plan and called upon the UN Security Council to take the necessary measures to compel Israel, the occupying power, to stop all its illegal actions, live up fully to its responsibilities under the Fourth Geneva Convention, and implement relevant UN resolutions. These ongoing Israeli violations seriously challenge the political will of the international community and represent a stringent test to the credibility, responsibility, and determination of key international actors to put an end to decades-long oppression, occupation, and injustices perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinian people, bring longed-for justice, and achieve the two-state solution. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, while emphasizing that the occupied city of Jerusalem is an integral part of the Palestinian territories occupied in 1967, the OIC urges all parties concerned to refrain from recognizing any measures aimed at changing its demographic, political, legal, and historical status, and continue to provide financial support for the Palestinian institutions in East Jerusalem. The Israeli illegal practices, injustice, and denial of the human rights of the Palestinian people must cease being unchecked. The lack of accountability and effective international deterrent measures have emboldened Israel and encouraged it to intensify its colonial and racist policies in East Jerusalem. And in this regard, we call again for activating legal mechanisms that guarantee the accountability and liability of Israel, the occupying power, and ensure international protection for the Palestinian people. We believe that the only way to put an end to the suffering of the Palestinian people, redress the injustice they have been enduring for decades, and contribute to bringing peace and stability and prosperity to the region is enabling the Palestinian people to establish their independent and sovereign state and enjoy their inalienable rights. And we call again to this end upon the international community, particularly the International Quartet, to engage actively and seriously in launching a credible, time-bound, multilaterally sponsored political process in the pursuit of a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the Palestinian issue based on internationally agreed terms of reference, including United Nations resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative. In closing, I wish to reaffirm the full support of the OIC for the Palestinian people in their endeavors to regain their legitimate and inalienable national rights, including their right to return, self-determination, and sovereignty in their state of Palestine on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Wishing this meeting every success, I thank you all for your attention. Thank you, Chair.
I thank you, Excellency, for your statement. We highly appreciate the collaboration of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation with our committee over the past year. And we are looking forward to continue this fruitful partnership with you. I would like now to request the representative of the State of Palestine, my brother and His Excellency, Mr. Riyad Mansour, permanent observer of the State of Palestine to the United Nations in New York, to deliver his remarks. Ambassador Mansour, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Anna, for giving me the floor. Let me, at the beginning, on behalf of the State of Palestine, to thank you, to thank the committee, to thank the chair, my dear brother, the Ambassador of Senegal, and all members of the committee for organizing collaboration with the OIC and with the outstanding help from the division, the seventh, or the first segment, the 7th International Conference, Annual Conference. I want also to thank my brother Khalid and my brother Ali from the OIC, Khalid from the Secretariat of the United Nations, for being with us and for sharing with us their important thoughts and ideas of the organizations that they represent. We also express our gratitude for the three presenters who will be sharing with us their thoughts and ideas. Second part is conference. We are grateful for them in participating with us in this conference and in bringing to the table the ideas that they will share with us. Of course, you know, the issue of Jerusalem started being violated from the beginning. The conflict that dates back to the late 40s, when, according to the UN partition plan, Jerusalem was supposed to have a special international status. The Israeli forces occupied parts of Jerusalem then in violation of Resolution 181, violations of international law. 1967, the Israeli occupying authorities declared de facto annexation from day one of the 4th of June of 1967. Of course, in 1980, they went to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and legislated annexation that led, among other things, to the adoptions of two resolutions in the Security Council, Resolution 476, which warned Israel from not legislating officially in the Knesset annexation and declared that if they do that, no one should recognize it and it would be null and void and had no legal remedy. Resolution 478, after they took that illegal step, the Security Council reaffirmed Security Council Resolution 476 and demanded many things, including those who have diplomatic missions or embassies in Jerusalem, remove them back to Tel Aviv. In Resolution 2334, the Security Council went a further step in the direction of accountability by demanding from the international community, operative paragraph 5, differentiate in the dealings with the region between the borders of Israel on the 4th of 1966 and the occupied area. Now that is the quick history that brings us to today, meaning that Israel was involved in annexation and violating international law from the first day of its creation with regard to Jerusalem. With regard to the life of people of Jerusalem, particularly the Palestinians, their life, one can see it, especially in East Jerusalem, through the constructions of massive settlements, the population of settlements in the hearts of the hundreds of thousands in East Jerusalem, annexation of land, the demolition of homes, expropriation of property, displacement of people, the removal of identity card and the economic hardships there, building the wall. It was a very sophisticated form of ethnic cleansing to make life hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem so unbearable, so that they leave East Jerusalem and allow it to become almost completely a Jewish city. So this is in summation the life of the Palestinian people in occupied Jerusalem. Why did we have this situation for this time? I think that my brother Ali alluded to that in referring to lack of accountability. Because if we all state correctly that Israel is violating international law, violating UN resolutions without consequences, then there isn't anything that would deter Israel from continuing in this illegal path that lasted for more than 70 years. And I think based on that tradition, negated or objected to by the international community with regard to the Israeli tradition and history. Israeli occupying authorities coming to the conclusion that the international community and all of us would declare correctly positions of condemning such action, saying that it is illegal, but we are not taking the needed additional steps of showing consequences. For example, in 1980, although we adopted 476 and 478, I know that the reality in the Security Council did not allow these resolutions to be adopted under Chapter 7, as is the case of many resolutions as it relates to many things, including the situation as we have witnessed for the last 10 years or more in the Middle East. And as one researcher told us that during the last 12 years, more than 700 resolutions were adopted in the Security Council. Half of them were under Chapter 7. most of them were related to conflict in the Middle East, whether in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, but not a single one of them related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was under Chapter 7. In fact, during that period of time, only 2 resolutions were adopted. And the last one was 2, 3, 4, and either one were adopted under Chapter 7. And as annexation is looming, if we do not embark in the direction of accountability and consequences, then Israel could, and those who support it in the Washington, D.C., and by that I mean Trump administration, which violated also international law and Security Council resolution by recognizing in the year 2017 Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moved its embassy to it in violation of resolutions 476 and 478 and 2334, just to mention a few of the Security Council resolutions. I sincerely hope that the ICC might bring something new to the table once the lower chamber to resolve the issue of jurisdiction so that the prosecutor to begin official investigation about war crimes committed against the Palestinian people in the occupied territory, including occupied East Jerusalem. I think that the big test before us is to stop annexation from taking place and to open doors for possibilities of options of measures, including legal options in the directions of accountability, because accountability not only that it would give Palestinian people justice, but it would open a meaningful door for a political process that would lead to the end of occupation and the independence of the State of Palestine on the 4th of June 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. So we are now at the beginning of a difference. And there is a massive support against annexation in the other parts of the occupied West Bank by the international community, by the Secretary General of the UN, by many political organizations, regional organizations, such as the Arab League, the OIC, NAM, the African Union, the European Union, which we appreciate tremendously, but that is not sufficient in itself to deter Israel from moving in the direction of annexing other parts of the occupied territory. Their record is shameful with regard to what they did to Jerusalem, and it is encouraging them to move in the direction of annexing other parts of the occupied Palestinian territory and destroying the two-state solution. Destroying the two-state solution meaning destroying the national aspirations of the Palestinian people to exercise self-determination in their historical national homeland and to manifest it in a state next to Israel and equal and dignified right for the Palestinian people who are inside Israel. So the task is tall before us. The Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights is a very special and noble committee that is working tirelessly over the years for advancing the cause of the Palestinians through the attainment of the inalienable rights of the Palestinians. And we are so grateful, this committee, to keep our question alive and help our people advance their cause until we reach the moment of achieving justice and declaring the independence of the State of Palestine, East Jerusalem as its capital, and fulfilling natural and legal rights of Palestine refugees based on international law and relevant resolutions. Sister Anna, Ambassador Anna, I thank you again for organizing, despite of the difficulties, the conditions of coronavirus. We are not deterred. We are continuing to work through virtual, through any possible way in order to continue advancing the cause of justice for the Palestinians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Mansour, for your remark. And let's assure that the members and observers of the committee will continue to support the Palestinian people. We will not rest until they have attained the inalienable rights completely and can live in free and sovereign state of Palestine. So before giving the floor to our panelists, let me say for the audience around the world that is watching this conference, a few words about our committee that was established by the UN General Assembly in 1975 to pursue the following main goals: promoting an end to the Israeli occupation and a just and peaceful settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, realizing the two-state solution, Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders, and supporting the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including self-determination, sovereignty, and the right to return. We implement our mandate by raising awareness on the question of Palestine through a range of activities, among them events and conferences at the UN headquarters here in New York and abroad, dissemination of information, a capacity building program for the state of Palestine, and the annual observance of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people on 29 November. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, our committee has adapted and shifted activities to the virtual space, like with this virtual event series, which we will continue into the coming weeks. Before we start, let me remind everyone that this is an event is being streamed live via the UN Web TV and the UN YouTube and Facebook channels. It's also being recorded and will be available for viewing at your convenience. I would like to give a warm welcome to the audience following us via different platforms. Everyone are also encouraged to tweet the hashtag, Right for Palestine. So you can use this hashtag to raise awareness of the cause of Palestine. So following the initial remarks by our panelists, I will open the virtual floor for discussion. We will also be able to take some questions which members can post via the chat box function in the WebEx. You have to use the chat box to ask questions, and the public can use the via a Facebook channel or Twitter, or also WhatsApp. The number of WhatsApp to raise some question is +1 646 421 0579. I repeat, +1 646 421 0679. So now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Maha Abdallah, legal researcher and international advocacy officer at the Cairo Institute of Human Rights Study in Jerusalem. Before that position, she was a senior legal researcher at the Palestinian NGO Al-Haq, focusing on business and human rights and corporate accountability in occupied territory and conflict-affected settings. Primarily, the role of the corporation in the unlawful exploitation of natural resources, complicity and involvement in human rights abuses. She was elected to the board of the International Network of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ESCR-NET, in 2018, and served on the project advisory group of ESCR-NET's Corporate Capture Project and on the Conflict and ESCR Advisory Group. Ms. Abdallah, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. In describing Palestinian life in annexed Jerusalem, it is a microsome of living in a prolonged and illegal occupation that not only seeks to control land, but also the lives of millions of Palestinians here and in the diaspora. This colonial endeavor has sought to fragment and segregate Palestinians, eradicate our identity, history, language, and culture, and repress Palestinian political and economic and social life. For decades, Israel has deepened its control over Jerusalem by exponentially increasing the number of Israeli Jewish settlers while working to eliminate Palestinian presence. To achieve its plans, Israel has used various discriminatory policies and measures against Palestinians, many of which constitute grave breaches and crimes. For one, Israel imposes a permanent residency status on the majority of Palestinians in Jerusalem, rendering them stateless. This has left Palestinians born in and with ancestors in the city for decades or centuries constantly required to prove to the occupier their links to Jerusalem to be allowed to even stay. In Jerusalem, Israel places no value on Palestinian life. Palestinians are constantly dehumanized. This is something easily spotted on the streets and in daily life, where Israeli forces routinely use excessive force, kill, and arrest Palestinians. As a Palestinian here, you are forced to constantly be on your guard because any misinterpreted move could literally cost you your life, as with the killings of Iyad al-Hallaq last May, Mus'ab al-Ghazali in 2015, and many other unjustified killings over the years by Israeli forces. The dehumanization and intimidation are further instilled through the Israeli forces' arbitrary stoppings, questioning, and searches of Palestinians on the streets, mainly targeting the youth. This is in addition to the heavy militarization and constant state of surveillance through installed cameras, sensors, and microphones all over the city. Intimidation and collective punishment in Jerusalem are also experienced in the persistent incursions and night raids on homes and neighborhoods by Israeli forces, most notably those regularly targeting Al-Isawiya neighborhood, resulting in injuries, child arrest, and a perpetual state of fear. At the same time, Israel has created a coercive environment, which has been already mentioned several times, to limit the number of Palestinians in Jerusalem, to realize its plan of 70% Israeli Jews to 30% Palestinian, resulting in the direct and indirect forcible transfer of Palestinians. This is implemented through ever-increasing house demolitions and evictions, practices that have continued even during the current pandemic. Revocation of residency has been yet another feature of Israel's methods to restrict Palestinian growth in Jerusalem under the pretext of the center of life requirement or as a punitive measure. Living in Jerusalem is also about being isolated. Jerusalem is not only cut off from the West Bank and Gaza, but also from its own neighborhoods and towns by military checkpoints, settlements, and the annexation wall. Another form of isolation is Israel's attempts to alienate Palestinians in Jerusalem from their own language, culture, and identity. It is common for Palestinians not to recognize streets or their names because these have been altered, creating new facts on the ground and a one-sided narrative for the benefit of one group only. To many Palestinians, Jerusalem has become sadly foreign and completely off limits. It's an imposed reality where we are unable to use our mother tongue at times, Arabic, in day-to-day encounters because Israel is deliberately erasing and systematically substituting it with Hebrew through laws and practice. Palestinian cultural centers and activities are regularly attacked. Religious practices are often restricted, most evidently during Ramadan and Easter. Meanwhile, Palestinian protests, demonstrations, and all attempts to organize against the foreign occupation are constantly met with force, suppression, arrest, travel ban, punitive measures. Israel has isolated and choked the Palestinian economy as well in Jerusalem, resulting in high poverty rates. Unemployment is relatively high, with limited and unequal opportunities. The old city of Jerusalem and its surroundings have become almost lifeless. There is a strong sense of frustration among Palestinian merchants stemming from the harsh reality, discriminatory restrictions, taxes, and fines, all of which have been aggravated by the pandemic, subsequent restrictions on movement, and absence of tourists. In fact, over the past few days, calls from individuals have been circulating on social media, leading Palestinians to visit and shop in the old city, in a humble attempt to help shopkeepers in the face of imminent collapse due to mounting financial burdens. Life in Jerusalem for Palestinians is suffocating and frustrating. People are tired, losing hope, and feel neglected. There is limited space to live and express one's identity. Eventually, Palestinians are coerced into making decisions that either allow them to stay in the city within Israel's allowed limitations or leave. While this is a very gloomy reality that I draw, it persists and worsens because of Israel's relentless attempts to achieve full colonization and a unified Jerusalem as their capital by means of ethnically cleansing Palestinians. These efforts have been emboldened by the international community's inaction and continued support. The international community has been indeed idle towards taking effective measures to end Israel's occupation and counter its persistent violations of international law, particularly those targeting Palestinians in Jerusalem, which rise to the level of war crimes and crimes against humanity, such as forcible transfer, willful killing, persecution, and apartheid, to name but a few. In viewing Israel's annexation, it is important that the international community not only take concrete action to deter any forthcoming Israeli declaration of annexation of the West Bank, but also to reverse and remedy those already ongoing in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the occupied Syrian Golan, using means of international accountability and sanctions. It is high time to challenge this new and unilateral imposed reality on Palestinians. Thank you.
I thank you, Ms. Abdallah, for your introductory remark. And before I continue, I would like to inform our participants that they are going to have the opportunity to take the floor to ask questions before the panelists. So before the panelists, we are going to open the session for questions for a statement of the member state and also other participants in this conference. I would like to give the floor to our next speaker, Ms. Hagit Ofran, Director of the Settlement Watch Project at the Israeli NGO Peace Now in Jerusalem. Widely recognized as one of Israel's foremost experts on a full range of issues related to illegal Israeli settlement in the West Bank, settlement-related developments in East Jerusalem. Her work includes traveling daily throughout the West Bank, examining aerial photos and browsing official Israeli documents. The Settlement Watch Project serves as a resource for Israeli politicians, diplomats, international media organizations, and first and foremost for the Israeli public. She is one of, and I quote, 66 Israeli women you should know. So it's a pleasure for us to know you today. And also is a women breaking barrier to fight stereotypes and building influence. So Ms. Ofran, it's an honor to have you here and you have
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm really honored to be here. I was born in Jerusalem, and it was already after Israel annexed 70 square kilometers to Jerusalem. And I remember as a child, an Israeli child, we used to celebrate every year the Jerusalem Day, which is the day where Jerusalem was unified. And this unification of Jerusalem is actually, what I didn't know as a child, was the day of occupation and also the day of annexation. And I want us to try to look into what Israel did in Jerusalem, and maybe we can learn a few things about how things might go if, God forbid, Israel annexes more of the West Bank. So here is a map of Jerusalem as it used to be before 67. You can see in blue the Israeli Jerusalem, and in brown, more or less, the Jordanian Jerusalem, and all the brown areas are the Palestinian build-up areas around Jerusalem. And 3 weeks after the war, in June 67, the government annexed 70 square kilometers. This red line you can see over here was annexed to Israel. It was done by a cabinet decision, or the government took a decision to apply Israeli law into those areas. So one thing we can learn from it is that annexation may happen just as a government decision. You don't have to have it in the Knesset, in the parliament as a legislation, although several years later it was also legislated. And then in order to maintain the unification of Jerusalem, that Israel wanted to keep all Jerusalem as under Israel, Israel started to build settlements in East Jerusalem. And there are three kinds of settlements in East Jerusalem. And for each kind, there are several ways to establish. The first kind of settlement is the big settlements that Israel built around the old city, more or less. And here on the map, you can see all the blue areas are settlements that Israel built after 1967. The idea was to isolate or to disconnect the Palestinian neighborhoods from the West Bank so that East Jerusalem will not serve as a capital for the Palestinian state. Of course, in order to do that, Israel had to take land. And if you see the map, almost all of the empty areas that were not built in 1967 were taken. And Israel took it through expropriation according to the Israeli law, which is now applied in East Jerusalem. The government is allowed to confiscate land for public use. And in this case, the public use was establishment of Israeli settlements. And if Israel would annex West Bank, then the limitation of the occupation laws, that is not allowing confiscations for the benefit of the occupier, will not be anymore, because Israel would say that it's for the benefit of all citizens or all residents or whoever. So this is one threat of annexation. The second kind of settlement was to try to settle within Palestinian settlements, most of them around the old city. Here's a map. You can see the old city in the center. You can see the brown areas are the Palestinian neighborhoods around it. And you can see also the red dots of houses that are being used by Israeli settlers. And the idea is to bring as many Jews to live inside Palestinian neighborhoods so that it will be mixed, so that when we will get to negotiations on two states, the Israelis will say this is not Palestinian neighborhood, it is Jewish neighborhood, or it's a mixed neighborhood. It is harder to give it up. It is going to make the possibility of a Palestinian state much, much harder. And that's what they're trying to do. And of course, they have many, many other effects on the ground to the presence of settlements inside the Palestinian neighborhoods. But this was not the only kind of settlement, not only the big settlements and the settlements inside the Palestinian neighborhoods, but there was a third kind of settlement, which is the touristic settlement. That is actually a huge amount of money that is being put, especially around the old city, to make touristic sites, archaeology, and to encourage Israelis and tourists to go there, and to this way to make the public domain more Israeli and to make Israelis more connected to the areas. Now, I wanted to say a few words on how Israel took all those houses in order to settle in the heart of Palestinian state. There were many ways to do it. And I want to mention in short, maybe I will have more time later to elaborate more, two main ways. One was the use of the absentee property law, because Israel applied Israeli law. One of the laws in Israel is the Absentee Property Law. And the Absentee Property Law says that if you have properties of Palestinian refugees that have left the country in 48, the government of Israel can make use of it. I will not go into all the details of that, but the law was implemented in Jerusalem in a way that actually Israel declared Palestinians as absentees and then took their house and gave it to settlers. And one of the victims of this system is the Sumarim family that are today facing eviction. You can see this picture is taken from their home. They live, and behind their home, you can see Al-Aqsa Mosque, the symbol, of course, for the Palestinians and for the Muslims, which is built on the Temple Mount, which is a symbol and the holy place for the Jewish people, the volcanic core of our conflict. And their house was taken through misuse of the Absentee Property Law. And we, in Peace Now, recently published a thorough report trying to explain how it worked. And there is a threat that if Israel annexes parts of West Bank, this will be also the case in hundreds of thousands of dunams that will be declared absentee property. And lastly, another way or another law that Israel used was a law that is called the legal and administrative law. And as you know, when before I speak about the law, I would show you the two places that are under big threat of being evicted. Batan el-Hawa, which is south of the old city, in Silwan. All the red areas are houses that already have court cases to evict them based on that law, and other areas, lighter blue, lighter red, are under threat of having a lawsuit. The blues are already settlements. Here we're talking about 80 families that are already in court cases, hundreds of people that might be evicted. And here in Sheikh Jarrah, also you can see in red, all those houses under legal proceedings to be evicted in favor of settlers. Also, we're talking about hundreds of people. And in this specific case is a law that Israel legislated after the annexation in order to regulate the lands that were included now in Israel. And one of the articles of the law said that if a property used to be owned by Jews before 48 and then was lost in the Jordanian side of the Green Line, then after 67, those Jews can reclaim it. And based on ownership before 48, now settlers are claiming ownership and kicking out Palestinians from their homes. Of course, those laws cannot be held legal under international law and in circumstances of annexation, of imposing one's laws, that on one hand, properties from before 48 can return to the Israeli owners, but properties before 48 can be taken from Palestinians in the same case. So this is the very unfortunate picture of one aspect of annexation in East Jerusalem, and I will now give the floor to the next panelist.
Thank you, Ms. Ofran, for the information provided already. Also for the work of our committee. Our third speaker today is Mr. Osamah Khalil, a historian and associate professor of history with a focus on U.S. foreign relations and the Modern Middle East at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He is the author of America's Dream Palace, Middle East Expertise, and the Rise of the National Security State of 2016, and the editor of the United States Foreign Relations with China and Iran toward the Asian Century of 2019. He's currently writing a book on the history of the Palestinian national movement. Mr. Khalil has been a frequent media commentator and contributor, including for the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, The Hill, Al Akbar, and Al Jazeera. Mr. Khalil, it's a pleasure for us to have you here, and you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's my pleasure to contribute to this important discussion. And I want to thank the committee and the organizers for holding this event and to distinguished guests for participating. I think it's important to put the present situation in Jerusalem and Palestine in a broader historical perspective of the past 53 years of occupation and over 7 decades of dispossession. Israel's action since 1967, really in the first month of the occupation, as several other speakers have noted, until today has been consistent. The idea is to impose and enforce laws and policies and then, one, claim they do not exist. As an example, Israel initially claimed its actions in Jerusalem were for municipal fusion, not annexation. And so whether it was the annexation of Jerusalem or the ongoing occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, including referring to those as disputed territories rather than as occupied territories, Israel has attempted to deny the realities of their policies as a way of shielding it from international criticism. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the June 1967 war, Israel's position on negotiations has been largely consistent until today. The first is that Jerusalem will remain Israel's undivided capital, that there will be no return to the pre-June 1967 borders, and that Israel will maintain control over the Jordan River Valley. Now, as annexationist sentiment increased in Israel in the post-war period, Israel began implementing policies that were designed to secure the maximum amount of land with minimal Palestinian population. Now, for Jerusalem, this led to several, as we've already heard from Hagit and from Maha, several deliberate and systematic policies. This included the expulsions in and around the city's boundaries as an attempt to decrease the number of Palestinians inside Jerusalem. This was then followed by expanding deliberately and systematically Jerusalem boundaries shortly after the occupation began, and then another process of creating Israeli settlements inside Palestinian East Jerusalem, including the Old City. Now, to be clear, Israel's policies toward Jerusalem and the broader settlement project were a joint effort between the Labor and Likud parties. This was not merely just the Likud party. Another joint project between the parties was to steadily erode American objections to Israel's overt and creeping annexation. So, how did this play out? In subsequent discussions with the United States, as it engaged in negotiations with the Arab states and eventually the Palestinians, Israel sought to ensure that Washington did not adopt positions that it found objectionable. This included accepting Israel's definition of UN Security Council Resolution 242, as well as 338, but also other positions related to the key final issues of borders, refugees, and Jerusalem. And this understanding was established very shortly after the June 1967 war and was then reaffirmed in secret understandings between the U.S. and Israel over the next 5 decades. Now, in secret and public negotiations with the Arab states and after 1993 with the Palestinians, Israel would publicly proclaim that they had no partner for peace or there was no suitable partner. Yet, through these negotiations, it continued to pocket concessions, especially on those key issues, Jerusalem, borders, and refugees, while offering very little in return and continuing to establish facts on the ground. So this was a precedent that was set in Jerusalem. It was established in the immediate aftermath of the June 1967 war and remained consistent for the next 5 decades. Dating to 1947, the United States adopted a position that Jerusalem was to be a corpus separatum and discussed in an international regime to govern Jerusalem, or at very least the religious sites in the city. However, the question remained about ultimate sovereignty over the city. Here, there were debates within the State Department and presidential administrations about what was possible. Would shared sovereignty be possible with Jordan, or after 1993 with a Palestinian state? But, as we now know, there was also a consistent element within the State Department that viewed Israel's occupation and annexation of Jerusalem as a positive. This was presented in the following way. It was a positive from the perspective of forcing normalization with the Arab states. It was presented as an overall positive to the Palestinians living in Jerusalem, in spite of the obvious discriminatory policies imposed by Israel after 1967, and as a positive to the world for the religious sites and open access to them. Therefore, a precedent was steadily established that ultimate sovereignty over Jerusalem would reside with Israel. Now, from the beginning of the occupation, the U.S. shielded Israel from international criticism, including in bodies like the UN. This precedent was established within the first month of the occupation and Israel's annexation of Jerusalem and would be consistent over the next 5 decades. In reality, it was only when Israel behaved in a manner that was overtly embarrassing to Washington, and it created difficulties for the U.S.'s international position, especially during the Cold War, that Washington publicly criticized Israel. In general, what this meant was that the United States did not openly object to Israel's creeping annexation of Palestinian lands. And when it did, Israel adopted, again, a very consistent pattern of dealing with the State Department and successive presidential administrations. First was in private discussions, Israel would emphasize that Washington should not focus on minor irritants like settlements or Jerusalem's status, but on the larger picture of U.S.-Israeli relations and the successive negotiations with the Arab states or the Palestinians. Meanwhile, Israel would rely on allies in the U.S. press and the Congress, as well as within the U.S. foreign policy establishment, to complain loudly about the pressure Washington was placing on Israel and the difficulties it was creating, and how, of course, how unfair this pressure was. Third, Israel would continue establishing facts on the ground, which would create further impediments to negotiations and any possible concessions to the Arab states or the Palestinians. Now, in annexing East Jerusalem, as I mentioned, Israel initially claimed this was merely an administrative action. It was just for, as they said, municipal fusion. However, it quickly became apparent that a system of separate and unequal policies and laws was created and enshrined over 5 decades. And here again, Jerusalem serves as a template for the rest of the Palestinian territories. Israel created and enforced a legal and administrative system that actively discriminates against Palestinians to encourage their immigration. In short, self-transfer and erasure. And self-transfer has become a key aspect of Israel's overt and creeping annexation of Jerusalem and Palestine. Another important feature of Israel's rule is to separate and depoliticize Palestinians in Jerusalem from Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, or Palestinian citizens of Israel. In other words, to ensure that there is no organized Palestinian political presence in Jerusalem. And this has been amplified since 2000 and the collapse of negotiations and the Second Intifada. In addition, it is to implement varying legal regimes governing the lives of Palestinians by their location. So whether it's Palestinian citizens of Israel with one set of rights, Palestinians in Jerusalem with distinct and lesser rights, or Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza under occupation with no rights, but subject to Israeli rule and overall sovereignty. These are key aspects of Israel's system of apartheid implemented over 5 to 7 decades, and Jerusalem is a major component of it. Finally, since the June 1967 war, Jerusalem and Israel has occupied the attention of American Christian evangelicals, who viewed the capture of the city's holy sites as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Now, this has aligned with a greater political engagement by evangelical voters and a shift in the U.S. electorate, especially since 1968. These voters see Jerusalem and Israel's control over Jerusalem, especially the holy sites, to be a vital issue, and for that control to be extended over the remaining territories. In other words, for all of historic Palestine to be seen as biblical Israel, to be supported and strengthened. Now, this perspective has been encouraged by the Likud party, especially Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as successive Israeli governments and the settler movement in Israel. This has created a strong alignment between the Likud party and the Republican Party in the U.S., which for over 4 or 5 decades has become the home of a large number of evangelical voters. We can see this today in the Trump administration, which is ideologically aligned with the settler movement. In addition, some of the administration's strongest support prior to the COVID-19 pandemic was from the evangelical community. At the same time, support for Israel is a bipartisan issue, and Democrats have been reluctant to criticize Israel. This was made clear in the debates over the Democratic Party's platform in 2016, and it emerged again yesterday in debates over the Democratic Party's 2020 platform. Indeed, on Trump's decision recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the Democratic nominee, former Vice President Joe Biden, has already said he will not reverse this decision. That being said, There are emerging splits in the evangelical community over Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, as well as among a new generation of voters within the Democratic Party. And these are hopeful signs and trends, and I'm happy to discuss those as well as some others in the Q&A. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Khalil, for your presentation. And now I would like to open the floor first to our panelists. Maybe you want to raise some comment on the other panelists' presentation, or maybe you have supplementary questions. So Ms. Abdallah, Ms. Ofran, and Mr. Khalil, you are invited to, you want to make another comment or raise some question. I invite you to raise your raising the hands. The hands in the WebEx is a small hand in the right side of your screen. So you have the floor in case of if you want to use it. Well, if not, I don't see any hands here. Well, if not, now we are moving to, I think, the question session of the forum. First, we are going to give the floor to member states that they want to pose some questions to our panelists. They want to make some statement. So, member states who want to speak, also they have to raise their hands. I was informed that the ambassador of Egypt want to speak. I don't know if the ambassador want to speak long before, so I don't know if he's here with us.
Yes, my dear Anna. Good morning, everyone.
Okay, Ambassador Mohammed, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, my dear sister Anna, for sharing this meeting, and thank you for the chair of the committee, my brother Ambassador of Senegal, and thank you for everyone who participated, and for the presence of my dear brother Minister Riyad Mansour, representative of Palestine, and really all the speakers enriched us with lots of informative and insightful presentations. Thank you for organizing this conference with the OIC. Definitely, let me reiterate Egypt's commitment to supporting the implementation of a just, comprehensive, and permanent settlement of the Palestinian question according to international law and UN resolutions, especially Resolution 2334 of 2016. Egypt has stated its position very clearly against any unilateral measures, especially Israel's annexation plans that would jeopardize the two-state solution. Any annexation plans will represent a clear violation of international law, UN resolutions, and a grave threat to the prospects of peace, in addition to endanger the whole stability in the region. The above position has been reconfirmed in the recent meetings, which Egypt has been engaged through the Egyptian foreign minister during his recent visit to Jordan and to Ramallah, also during the meetings of the Committee of the Arab Peace Initiative and the Munich formula with our partners from France, Germany, and Jordan. The international community has showed its wide support to the agreed upon peace parameters, including UN resolutions, the Arab Peace Initiative, and the Land for Peace principle. Let me just here pose triad of issues, and maybe it could be also, we can be enlightened by the comment of the panelists on it. First is we have a paradox and irony and a tragedy. A paradox that everyone understands and convinced about the illegality of the annexation. And we hear this once and again in Security Council and so many fora. But however, the paradox is convinced on one side, but no action on the other side, or no meaningful action on the other side. There is also, with the paradox, there is an irony of multiple problems in the region, which are competing of international attention and international resources. However, no problem of them is witnessing any meaningful solution in sight. The third is a tragedy of the life of Palestinians under occupation, and at the same time, in a world which is talking a lot about human rights and the values of human rights. So this triad, I think, is very perplexing and confusing. to conclude, I think I would like to say that my dear brother, Ambassador, Minister of Riyad Mansour, Palestine, mentioned that two states, the annexation will destroy the two-state solutions. I agree with him, and I add that it will destroy two-state solutions, and as he mentioned, it will also destroy the aspirations of the national aspirations of the Palestinians. And I add that it will also destroy the regional aspirations of peace, security, and stability in the region. In conclusion, Egypt reiterates its support to the Palestinian people in fulfilling their aspirations towards self-determination and establishing their own independent state on pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Mohammed. And now I give the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative.
Thank you, Ambassador Anna. At the outset, I would like to express my deep appreciation to the United Nations Palestinian Rights Committee and its Secretariat, as well as to the OIC for organizing this important event. And I thank ASG Khalid Khiari, Ambassador Ali Gutali, and all the other briefers for their valuable contributions. In line with its steadfast and principled position on the Palestinian cause, Tunisia reaffirms that any decisions or actions which pretend to have altered the character, status, or demographic composition of the holy city of Jerusalem have no legal effect, are nil and void, and must be rescinded in compliance with the relevant resolution of the Security Council. As we reiterate our condemnation of the continuing Israeli occupation and annexation plans, which constitute a flagrant violation of international law, we stress that Jerusalem is a final status issue to be resolved through negotiations in line with relevant United Nations resolutions. Tunisia reiterates its firm support to the brotherly Palestinian people in its struggle to regain its legitimate rights, establish its independent and sovereign state on its land within the borders of June the 4th, 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, and resolve all final status issues in accordance with the International Legality Resolution, the Two-State Vision, and the Arab Peace Initiative. The UN Secretary General stated in his latest report on the implementation of Resolution 2334 that the approval of expansion plans for the Hagit settlement in East Jerusalem is very alarming, because it is yet another clear signal that the government of Israel intends to solidify the continuum of illegal settlements in the area and disconnect East Jerusalem from the occupied West Bank's other Palestinian communities, such as Bethlehem, to its south. This issue was mentioned by the briefers, and it is in fact an implementation of the annexation. My question is, what can be done to stop this process? And I ask the briefers if they can further elaborate on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I'm going to give the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Anna?
Yes?
I want to clarify something, before we go further, that was stated by my brother Muhammad Idris from Egypt. If I may.
You have the floor, Ambassador.
I said that if annexation to take place according to the plans of the current Israeli government supported by the Trump administration, so-called 30% of the occupied West Bank, it may destroy the two-state solution. But I did not say it will destroy the aspiration of the Palestinian people. Nothing can destroy the national aspiration of the Palestinian people short of complete defeat of the Palestinian people. Palestinian people will not be defeated. Palestinian people will continue struggling for their national aspiration in their national historic land. But as long as they are on the land and they are steadfasting on the land and they are struggling for their rights and they are not only those who are in the occupied territory, but also those who are inside Israel, so-called known as the 1948 Palestinians who carry the Israeli passports and the Palestinians in the diaspora. So I don't think that it is an accurate characterization that if there is a huge setback, the two-state solution through annexation that should not be equated with the negation of the national aspirations of Palestine. We are rooted in that land for thousands of years, and we are intending to remain there. But the two-state solution would avoid having it as a perpetual occupation and conflict between us and the Israelis. But if their choice continue denying our rights and denying acknowledging it, and they should not but blame themselves for the continuation for this perpetual conflict, because we are not intending to leave, nor we are intending to surrender and to raise white flags. So our national aspirations will be alive, but it might take different forms, different strategies, different tactics. The conditions on the ground will dictate that, and the readiness and willingness of our people to see what kind of tactics and plans and strategies we would adopt under the future conditions that will remain to be dictated by the future. But we will never surrender our national aspiration under any condition. We might have problems with the two-state solution platform, but that does not mean that our national aspiration is abandoned. I just wanted to clarify that, Madam Chair, for dealing with it immediately after my brother Muhammad said that. I am sure that he did not mean what appeared to be the death, the national aspirations of Palestinian people. Might maybe something else, and that's why I want to clarify. And I want to thank the three presenters for their very, very important presentations. And I'm looking forward to meet my brother Osamah from Syracuse. I'm delighted, to see this young, I assume, Palestinian American with his sophistications and the issues that he raised. I hope that I will have the opportunity to meet with him. I think it would be easier for me to meet him because he's in Syracuse, I am in New York, than the other two presenters, whom I would be looking also forward to meeting with them in person to continue the discussion. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Allow me, Madam President, Anna,
Yes,
just to express my full agreement with my dear brother, Ambassador Minister Riyad Mansour. I fully agree, of course, with what he mentioned, and I definitely fully agree with the content. Maybe I misheard the quotation, but definitely with the content and the meaning which he expressed, I fully, of course, subscribe and agree. Definitely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Mohammed. And before giving the floor to the representative of Indonesia, and taking into account that now we have exchanged, I think that the Ambassador of Tunisia will pose a question to the panelists. So if you want to answer the question of the Ambassador of Tunisia, please raise your hand or raise your hand here in that way. So any of the panelists would like to answer the question of the Ambassador of Tunisia? No, I don't see.
I would like to try.
Okay, so you have the floor.
Thank you. The question was, what can we do? What can be done in order to stop the annexation? I think if we had the formula of how to stop it, we would have used it already and stopped the occupation. So we don't really know what, but we can know that clear and firm international standing that will not accept, like until today, never accepted the annexation of East Jerusalem, the potential annexation of the West Bank, and any violation of international law, of the human rights of people. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of being, drawn into politics that is like, it's not that you will be an anti-Semite if you are against occupation or against what Israel is doing. And I can say it as an Israeli, as a Jew that really care about Israel. I think we need to hear from the world that it is not okay what we're doing and how we are going through. And I think this firm attitude can help us in preventing further deterioration. Also, I think instead of putting the pressure on bringing the sides to talk, we should put the pressure on stopping the violations. Because when we say, please sit and talk, and the two sides and the leadership, unfortunately today, at least the Israeli one is not ready to really talk. So if you drag them to talk, they will continue and destroy and build in settlements, etc. Okay, you don't want to talk, at least don't destroy what is possible. And another thing I want to say, like an anecdote, maybe I should show you another thing about the United City of Jerusalem. You see, I cannot now share my screen anymore. But anyway, I am, as a Jerusalemite, can tell you, thank you, that although Israel annexed Jerusalem and decided that it is united forever, it was never really united. And that we had 53 years to make this one city and to make equality and to integrate the East Jerusalem into it. And as you saw in the map, it is very far from being united. You have distinguished Palestinian neighborhoods and distinguished Jewish neighborhoods. You see here the browns are the Palestinian neighborhoods and the blues are the Israeli neighborhoods. And, every Yom Kippur, which is the holiest of the Jews, the police puts up blocks on the streets because in the Jewish neighborhoods, nobody is driving the car and everybody is walking on the streets. So they don't want cars to drive into the crowd. So they put the blocks, and I asked the police, give me the map of the roadblocks that you put on Yom Kippur. And this is the map that I got. You can see all the yellow dots over here. It's where there is a block. And this block of Yom Kippur can show you exactly the map of the existing border of Jerusalem that is between the Jewish neighborhoods and the Palestinian neighborhoods. Or if you want, here in the red dotted line is a potential two-states agreement where you have the Palestinian neighborhoods as the capital of Palestine and the Jewish neighborhoods part of Israel. You see that on the ground, but Israel is today continuing to have two cities in Jerusalem, meaning that if we are going to annexation, don't expect, like some people in the United States started to say, okay, two-state solution is dead, now we are going to one state. It's not going to be one state. It's going to be segregated communities, different civil rights, and it will, unfortunately for me to say, it will be an apartheid, and we cannot approve that.
Thank you, Ms. Ofran. I think that
So
everybody knows that
if I
this
could
is,
just add, Your Excellency, if I could just add a point to that, if you don't mind.
okay, okay.
So
No,
just real quick, I do think we actually have, and this is where I disagree slightly with Hagit. We actually do have an example, and I think we have to be very clear that apartheid exists right now. It's not that it's going to get there with annexation. Annexation is occurring on a steady basis, and the United Nations knew how to deal with apartheid when it came to Southern Africa, and it overcame a lot of opposition, including from the United States, in addressing apartheid in South Africa and in Rhodesia and in Southwest Africa. So I think what we need to think about is how can we move away from this focus on negotiations in which Israel has made it clear it doesn't want to negotiate. And Benjamin Netanyahu has made it very clear for 20 plus years that his goal was to end negotiations, and he has done that. And he's been aided by several administrations in doing that. And so for the UN to actually have the courage now, as it did in the 1960s and 1970s, to stand up and say, apartheid is wrong. Apartheid in Southern Africa was wrong, and apartheid in Palestine is wrong. And Israel's policies are wrong. And what we need, and to stand with the Palestinian people. So we have a very prestigious group of ambassadors here, many who remember these arguments and these fights and the fight for freedom in South Africa and the fight for freedom in Southern Africa itself against the white minority racist regimes. We are dealing with that exact same situation in a variegated rule, legal regimes, separate and unequal, deliberately so, a steady annexation process. We have a template. We have a template of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, heavy sanctions that can be applied. And what we need is for the international community to step up and say that we stand with the Palestinian people in their time of need, and we stand against apartheid, as we did in Southern Africa.
thank you. I see that Ms. Abdallah would like to answer also. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Your Excellency. I just wanted to add to the question. I think one of the reasons why we are here today in a situation that has evolved in such a devastating into such a devastating reality is also the lack of any accountability and the culture of impunity that Israel has persistently enjoyed. Words are not enough anymore. We have come to a point of no return, unfortunately, in Palestine. And we do have numerous mechanisms that we should be activating as member states, as civil society, as Palestinian advocates and activists. I think one key issue here that we're talking about is ensuring support, ongoing support for the International Criminal Court. And hopefully, if an investigation does proceed forward into the situation of Palestine, I think member states, especially those that pride themselves in upholding international law and principles and human rights standards, should be pushing this forward and protecting the integrity and the work of the court during the investigation process. And there are numerous ways as well that can be practically applied, whether it's by imposing individual restrictive measures or individual sanctions and travel bans on all those perpetrating serious violations of international law and crimes against Palestinians, or by ensuring that there is genuine differentiation between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, that settlement products are banned as a fulfillment of an obligation for third-party states under international law, and that at least businesses and business enterprises operating in the occupied Palestinian territory under Israel's jurisdiction are not contributing contributing to the state of occupation, land appropriation, natural resource exploitation, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Abdallah. And now I'm going to give the floor to the representative of Indonesia. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, my dear sister, Ambassador Ana Rodriguez. And let me also thank the organizer for convening to this conference, a very timely and important meeting for us all. Not only does the meeting take place in the midst of global pandemic, but also in the midst of watershed moment in the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Let me also thank all the speakers and panelists for their very comprehensive, enlightening, as well as insightful remarks during this conference. Well, on annexation, Indonesia has consistently denounced any action that would destroy the fundamentals of the peace process, inflict adverse impacts on millions of Palestinians, and stabilize the region and beyond. I would also like to reaffirm Indonesia's unequivocal solidarity and support of the Palestinian people to achieve their inalienable rights, including the establishment of a contiguous independent state of Palestine within the pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. As much as we welcome the light progress on the implementation of Israel's plan to annex Palestine, we cannot afford to be complacent and must remain vigilant. We need to keep mobilizing the support of the international community to ensure the end of the annexation plan and the end of Israel's illegal occupation. With that in mind, actually, I have a similar question with what has been raised by Tarek a few moments ago and has already been elaboratively explained by the three panelists. But I would add to the other question, actually, regarding the quartet. To the panelists, how do you foresee the possibility of resuming the negotiation by the quartet and relevant parties? What are the preconditions to bring them to the table? Thank you very much.
Well, if I may.
Senegal, who is also the chairman of the committee. Ambassador Liang, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, my dear sister, Ambassador Ana Silva Rodriguez, and for the very good job you are doing right now. We are very proud of what you are doing. And I would like to thank all our panelists for the very enlightening presentations. They are all very captivating in understanding what's going on in Palestine. I think we are all in agreement that Israel is violating international law. We know that the state of Israel is using all means, measures, ploys to remove Palestinians from Palestine in a way, and even in Jerusalem. So there are so many ploys are being used, like sending them, having, for example, streets names being removed from Arabic, and so there is a policy which is there, which is really trying to change the character of the city of Jerusalem. And I think we need to have two routes to follow. There's only one, which is a political one. And I agree with Mr. Osamah Khalil that we need to do more to put the pressure at international level to make sure that Israel can be responsive to international law. And also, I think also the other route is the judicial one. And I think it would be very important that at that level also, more powerful, let's say, mobilization be organized. As you know, in November 2019, the ICG released a briefing paper stating that Israel must comply with its obligations and international law and review its current policies. I think the judicial route for me, in my view, and I'm speaking on my own personal view, not as chair or not even as the ambassador of Senegal, but I think that at the judicial level there is something missing there. Some actions have been initiated, but I think we need to do more. I would like also to have the views of the panelists on how best we can address that, how best we can make sure that Israel can be drawn at the judicial level and also respond to what it has to do. So this, I don't want to be long. This is just what I wanted to do, and I would appreciate if I can have any feedback from our panelists on the way we should do to enhance Israel's responsibility and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Liang. Before giving back the floor to the panelists, I would like to give the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative of South Africa. have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Anna. And we also wish to thank all the speakers and all the panelists for their wonderful presentation today. Their comments are very insightful. South Africa remains great the deterioration of the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Whether annexation is implemented partially or totally, we believe that the international community, including the Security Council, must take tangible action in respect of international law and relevant resolutions, including those of the Security Council. Speaking at the Security Council on 21 July, the president of the U.S. Middle East refraining from de jure annexation must, of course, carry no reward. Avoidance of criminality is not normative, not prize-worthy. Close quote. Israel's continued escalation of its settlement activities, detention, arbitrary arrests, harassment, destruction of Palestinian property, and of Palestinians residing in areas for annexation is a violation of social and economic impact. Yet Israel continues to hamper Palestinian efforts to combat the virus, making a severe crisis even worse. In line with South Africa's constitutional mandate, foreign policy priorities, our country continues to stand in solidarity with the people of Palestine in the wake of Israeli aggression. We reaffirm our continued support to the Palestinian independence struggle. Under annexation, Palestinians would be left with nothing more than a bandstand, ending all hopes for an independent, viable, and contiguous Palestinian state. In conclusion, Chairperson, a credible, time-bound, multilateral sponsored political process to resolve the issue as the vision of the two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. South Africa will therefore continue to support concrete and genuine efforts towards achieving this just and lasting solution, which we believe will greatly contribute to peace, justice, and stability in the whole region. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sotiza. Now I give the floor back to the panelists to answer the question and comment made by the distinguished representative member states.
I'd like to make a quick point if I could. And I want to thank the ambassadors, the distinguished ambassadors for their comments. On the issue of the quartet, I think what we risk reactivating the quartet is a return to where we were when the quartet was initially created, which is that it became yet another forum to put pressure on Palestinians for concessions while allowing Israel more excuses to continue making facts on the ground, the establishment of the wall, seizing additional Palestinian land, expropriations. All this process has done is given additional life to the settlement movement and the expropriation of Palestinian land, and the further institutionalization and implementation of apartheid policies in Palestine. What actually needs to happen now is for the international community to begin systematic pressure on Israel to abide by its responsibilities, A, as a UN member state, B, to Maha's point, using the ICJ and the ICC to begin applying international law and international human rights law against Israel for its violations of the Palestinians, including apartheid, holding Israel to account for its apartheid policies, not just in Jerusalem, but throughout the West Bank, and pushing for equal rights for all within the boundaries of Israel-Palestine. That, I believe, is the only path forward. I'm afraid that any continued attempts to revive negotiations based on these outdated formats, using outdated structures like the quartet, will only allow Israel more and more opportunities to seize land and delay the inevitable while it imposes apartheid on the Palestinians. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Ms. Abdallah. She wants also to answer.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I would like to build on my previous answer to try and answer parts of Ambassador Neong's question on what can be done to ensure accountability at an international level. And again, the ICC is definitely one way to seek accountability. One way, it's a mechanism not only to hold people accountable and perpetrators accountable, but to deter future crimes and future serious violations from taking place. In the case that goes on or it doesn't go on, I think also activating universal jurisdiction mechanisms in the various countries around the world is also something that we should be seeking more of on the question of Palestine. And whether it's for Israeli perpetrators or as officials, official representative of the states, or for Israeli individuals or other individuals that have been so strongly and intrinsically associated with the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity in the OPT, including corporate actors that have been seriously involved over the decades. And then again, we look at the other mechanisms available for us. And one most striking one would be the Human Rights Council. And it's at the end of the day, the resolutions, whether the ones that are voted in favor on, that there's weak implementation, weak enforcement, if any at all, to be frank on this. And especially when we're talking about accountability resolutions that are being voted on at the Human Rights Council, particularly specific on the situation of Palestine, particularly yes, depending on fact-finding missions and commissions of inquiries, investigating certain incidents. And I think these also allow, for more concrete and more vocal voicing of states' positions and actions and so on. And lastly, I think consequences is the key word in ensuring accountability. If there are no consequences, Israel will continue to perpetrate violations if nobody's going to stop it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Abdallah. Now we are receiving a question from viewers that are following us from different platforms. So what I'm going to do is to post the question actually, and giving back the floor to the panelists to answer them. The first question is from Mohammed Gardarli from the Lebanese Mission, and the question is, I would like to ask if there are organized efforts from the civil society to preserve the presence of Palestinians in East Jerusalem. So this is one of the questions I'm going to raise it again. I would like to ask if there are organized efforts from the civil society to preserve the presence of Palestinians in East Israel. The second question is a long question from Lina in Palestine. Ms. Abdallah referred to policies of apartheid in the city of Jerusalem and with respect of the Palestinian people as a whole, who have been denied the exercise of their inalienable rights since the Nakba of 1948. Can you explain how Israel's current annexation, including of West Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, and the occupied Syrian Golan, as well as planned annexation of large part of the West Bank, can be understood as part of the institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination over the Palestinian people, which the Rome Statute of International Criminal Court defined as the crime against humanity of apartheid? You want that I read the question again? Fine. And the third question is from Libras in India. The question is for Ms. Ofran. And the question is there any particular reason to justify a secular United States obsession with a religious, Jewish, objective over Jerusalem? Ms. Ofran, do you want to read the question again? Yes, so the question is there any particular reason which justify a secular United States obsession with a religion, in brackets, Jewish, objective over Jerusalem? So I'm going to start the question with Ms. Abdallah. You have 2 questions. So I'm going to start with you, and then I give the floor to Ms. Ofran. You have the floor, Ms. Abdallah.
Thank you, and thanks for the audience for these questions. With regards to the first question about organized efforts from civil society to protect or empower the presence of Palestinians in Jerusalem, that's definitely present. But as I tried to highlight in my short intervention, is that these are also coming under attack, and the space for civil society, for Palestinian civil society in Palestine in general, but particularly in East Jerusalem, is under severe restrictions and severe methods to control it, to limit its space, and to diminish its presence and weaken it. I think one of the very eminent examples that come to mind is that during this state of pandemic, how Palestinians tried to organize in the city of Jerusalem in order to support each other, in order to plan for food packages and other required services, because there was a lack of that or that support to Palestinians, and that was completely shut and completely prevented by the Israeli forces from continuing to happen. And this is just one example. We have seen many organizations, many civil society organizations that provide services and support for the Palestinian community in Jerusalem being shut down over the years. The restrictions on funding from the international community is also another thing. The state of intimidation and fear that's instilled by the Israeli authorities and forces into Palestinians in Jerusalem make them not want to be participants or active members of the society. So, but they still do, of course, and that's something that is very proudful of, definitely. As for the second question about institutional discrimination and apartheid, again, as Osamah mentioned earlier, it does exist. Apartheid does exist in Palestine, regardless of the geographic scope that you decide to focus on, whether it's in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, or elsewhere. It does exist, and you can see that in really institutionally, in the laws, in the policies, in the practices that are applied by the Israeli authorities against Palestinians. I think one of the most evident piece of law that we can look at is the nation-state law, the Jewish nation-state law, and what consequences it has on entrenching and deepening a system of apartheid against Palestinians. And here I would like to remind that apartheid is also a crime, and for that it needs to be brought into we need to hold the perpetrators account to that. Thank you.
Ofran?
Yes, thank you. Just to complete the question on apartheid, I want to mention that Israeli human rights organization called Yesh Din published 2 weeks ago a legal opinion that is analyzing the criminal offense of apartheid and analyzing Israel's policies in the West Bank in the 53 years and especially today, and actually showing how the Israeli policy in the West Bank is absolutely in the definition of apartheid, and I encourage all of you to take a look on Yesh Din website and read this very important legal opinion. As for the religious aspects of our conflict, or the religious aspect of East Jerusalem, I'm not sure I understood the question so well, but if I understand it, the two sides have sincere connection to the holy sites in Jerusalem. It's a symbol for both of them, And in East Jerusalem, in the Palestinian Jerusalem, there are many sites that are holy for me and important for me as a Jew, as an Israeli, and also for the Palestinians. And I think what is happening by Israelis' policies in this area is that Israel is trying to impose only the Jewish narrative on the whole public domain of East Jerusalem. And you can see it in so many aspects, and we cannot go into all the details of that. And I think that if Israel is claiming sovereignty over like Jerusalem, which is holy for so many people, we need to take responsibility to respect all other how all religions are looking at those areas and to preserve it. If you are a sovereign, you're supposed to be also responsible. Unfortunately, Israel is not doing that, and I think there is a lot to be done in order to hold Israel accountable, or at least to put the public attention on the touristic and religious developments on the ground in East Jerusalem. However, I do believe that the two sides can have a compromise that will have arrangements to both sides to respect the holy sites of the others and to have two states in two capitals.
If I may, Ambassador, I just wanted to add on the question on the Nakba. I think it's very important to understand that the Nakba is what we would call a historical process. It's not just a singular event. So the Nakba mean Arabic for catastrophe. So the destruction of Palestinian society that occurred in 1948 and continues to today, that this is a process. It wasn't just one singular event. It began in 1947, 1948, and then continues today in various different forms. And so we can see that when we talk about, as the questioner asked, about neighborhoods in West Jerusalem that were depopulated, those Palestinians who became refugees in 48. We saw it again in 1967, another 150,000 to 200,000 Palestinians who became refugees as a result of the 1967 war. We see it in the steady annexation and depopulation policies of Israel, whether it's with the Bedouins in the Negev, whether it's in the Jordan River Valley, whether it's attempting to force Palestinians from rural communities into the cities, thereby also trying to do this self-transfer, forcing them to leave Palestine, their ancestral home. So we see this again and again, the same types of policies, and overriding all of it is not just the system of discrimination, but the system of apartheid that we actually need, Palestinians need the United Nations to step up as they did in the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s to take a firm stance against these policies, to work with Israeli activists on the ground who understand that what is needed now is an end to these policies, an end to apartheid in Israel-Palestine, and equality for all. And I'm hoping that this will be the beginning of that discussion.
Dear colleague, we are running a little bit out of time. I would like to ask, yes?
Whenever you have some time, I just want to have...
Ambassador, let me explain. We are running out of time. We are going to lose the UN Web TV. We can run a little bit over 12 on WebEx. So but you have the floor in order to let people know that maybe after 12, we are not going to see Web TV.
Okay. All right. Quickly. Again, we appreciate everything that everyone is saying. Let me just emphasize, there is no silver bullet in dealing with that issue. This is an unfolding dynamic situation. This connection, the Palestinian people are struggling at so many different levels. For example, the 2 million Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel, who are suffering the most from the nationality law that Maha referred to, that is a very clear case of apartheid and discrimination. It applies fully and vividly to them. In Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, you have the combinations of elements of apartheid and struggling against occupation. In the West Bank, especially with regard to settlements, there is a global and powerful opposition from the international community, and the demand is still on the table. We want to end occupation. By getting involved in ignoring that and ignoring the global condemnation and against settlements, and to try to shift that it is everything is apartheid, I think that we're making it more difficult on the Palestinian people to move forward than easier. It's not an analytical issue. It is a daily issue of struggle. I do not benefit from condoning settlements under the banner, I want to now fight for equality. Equality for our brothers and sisters who are citizens of the State of Israel. If it is possible, equality in East Jerusalem, but yet the struggle is for ending occupation and struggling as well against, all elements and symptoms of apartheid. But we should not emote global consensus everywhere by the international community, which is very clear in opposing policies and practices of Israel in the occupied territory against settlement with regard to annexation, confiscation of land. These things are also war crime. I'm here referring to the issue of settlements. It is as the war crime of apartheid. So therefore, the Palestinian people will dictate the details of and the tactics of their struggle for their rights. And their rights, and occupation, to oppose settlements, to have equality, and to fight against apartheid, particularly inside Israel. All these things, the Palestinian people are involved in them. We will continue this. The last comment about the quartet. The one that is opposing now any role for the quartet is the U.S. administration. The reason why they are opposing it, because they don't want any element of collectivization dealing with that. They are paralyzing the Security Council as a result of the veto, and they are paralyzing the quartet because they don't want any collectivization, and they want the monopoly of the process and the control of the Palestinians to come to negotiate with the Israelis. And that's why the Palestinians for the last 2.5 years are saying we will not negotiate under the Trump plan. And we are willing to involve in a meaningful political process on the basis of international law, UN resolutions, to end the occupation that started in 1967 and to allow for the independence of the state of Palestine with East Jerusalem as its capital and the rights of refugees under the international law. So therefore, for us, maybe we don't blame civil societies and activists and academicians to see the merits sometimes of the small tactical battles of how to defend ourselves and to isolate those who want to impose on us things of a strategic nature, of a tactical nature, in order to bend us down and to attract us to their ideas. So, for example, for my friend, Osamah, he doesn't need to see the merits of some of the tactical battles that I engage in and all of my colleagues at the UN in order not to allow the U.S. administration to continue manipulating the process. If I can shift it to the Security Council and give the role to the Security Council, I trust more people to be involved in our issue. If I cannot succeed because of the veto, if there is a way to allow the quartet to play some role in opposing annexation, that has tactical value for me. But the idea is I don't want to be a prisoner of the manipulation of the Trump administration. I respect those who might not see any merit in these things, but as we do not tell our friends in the civil society movement how to conduct their work and what tactics and strategies they follow, we support everything they do. I think it would be also useful to see, to give us some leeway in that direction. And after all complement each other because we are all working for the same objective, which is justice for the Palestinian people. As the Palestinian people decide through their collective organized elements, whether the political parties, the PLO, the civil society organizations, their supporters inside Israel, those who work for peace inside Israel, and those who work for justice through the whole, all corners of the globe. I think that this discussion is extremely useful. Civil society organization should continue to maximize the pressure on representatives of the government. That is useful so that representatives of government, as they legislated, for example, operative paragraph 5.334 Security Council resolution to differentiate in the occupied territory and the borders of Israel. These are important steps that will be hopefully followed by additional steps if the international environment allow, so that we can move more and more in the general direction. The struggle of our brothers and sisters in South Africa against apartheid lasted for a long period of time. And every small help from every corner of the globe to support the steadfastness and the struggle of the people in South Africa led at the end of the day to the destruction of that abhorrent system, apartheid. I believe the support of everyone for the struggle of the Palestinian people over time, at the appropriate time, hopefully soon, will also succeed in allowing the Palestinian people to attain their inalienable rights, all of their rights, including self-determination, independence, and the right of the refugees. Sorry, Anna, but I thank you so much. Wonderful chairmanship.
Thank you.
If I may, I know we're not on the web TV.
Osamah, I want to have a discussion.
Yes, I think it's important we have a discussion. I think it's also important, Ambassador. It's important that we're not all working in the same direction. Let's be clear, we're not all working in the same direction. You represent a government, Ambassador. You represent a government that collaborates with Israel, security collaboration with Israel. You've represented them for a long time.
Listen,
the president claims this. The president says this. The president says this.
We disagree, but we are together.
He says it's sacred. Let's not pretend that we're all working in the same direction, Ambassador.
Let's not divide each other.
Let's not pretend. You're the ones that are dividing us, Ambassador. You're the ones that are dividing us.
Ms. Ambassador, we are running really, we are running out of time. We are not going to conclude or to closure our session. I think that you can continue talking bilateral. I would like to thank everybody for all the participants for insightful questions and the intervention. And in particular, I would like to thank our panelists, Ms. Abdallah, Ms. Ofran, Ms. Khalil, for taking time to participate in this meeting, sharing important information and their insights, and answering all the questions from members and from the audience. I call on all members and observers of the committee, on the member state at large, and defender of international law and human rights to take action collectively in your national capacity to avert the annexation in the West Bank that would jeopardize irreversibly the two-state solution. Now it's time to act in a coordinated and decisive manner. In this context, we must continue highlighting that East Jerusalem have been living on the annexation for decades and must not be overlooked or even forgotten. I think that we need to continue put pressure, raising awareness, mobilizing the international community against annexation and against the occupation. So before I conclude, I would like to thank all the members, states and observers of the committee, the wider UN membership, our partners in the civil society, and the public at large for participating in today's conference. I would like to especially thank the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, represented today by Ambassador Bontali, for continuing to be a supportive partner of the community. To conclude, I would like to remind everyone that recording of this meeting will be shortly uploaded in the webpage of the committee in www.un.org/UNISPAL, where you will be able to learn more about the question of Palestine, the work of the committee, and upcoming events, and on your also YouTube page. The committee will, through the Division of the Palestinian Right, keep you all updated on the day and time of the second part of this conference, which we plan to hold late tomorrow. I thank the Secretariat for the organization also. I thank also the Secretariat for the organization of the conference. I thank also the technician to help us to keep running the event, and all the participants. I herewith declare closed the first part of the 2020 International Conference of the Equation of Jerusalem. Thank you again to all the participants to be here with us today. Bye.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you, my brother. Thank you everybody. Thank you very much.
Anna, brother President. Thank you, Anna.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, Riyadh.
Thank you, Muhammad.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.